We can't do this stuff because, like we used to, do it all the time.
Ian Gillan just did something that shatters every unwritten rule of rock and roll brotherhood.
For the last 20 years, solidly from the Israeli lobby, they've tried to destroy my career over.
The man who spent 5 decades diplomatically navigating band breakups, industry politics, and personal feuds with legendary musicians, just released a statement about Roger Waters that's so brutal, so personally devastating, that it doesn't just defend Ozzy Osbourne's memory. It completely destroys the carefully constructed myth of Roger Waters as a principled artist who stands above the commercial filth of rock and roll. And this wasn't some knee-jerk emotional reaction to Waters' attack on a dead man's legacy. This was Ian Gillan finally breaking a silence he's maintained for over 40 years, revealing that Waters' cruelty toward Ozzy Osbourne isn't an isolated incident or a momentary lapse in judgment. It's a pattern of behavior that Gillan has personally witnessed destroy careers, damage reputations, and leave emotional wreckage across the entire rock industry. Here's what makes Gillan's statement so absolutely unprecedented. In 50 years as Deep Purple's frontman, through every lineup change, every business dispute, every personal betrayal that rock bands inevitably face, Gillan has never publicly condemned another major artist. Never. This is a man who's maintained professional relationships with musicians who sued him, who stayed cordial with former bandmates who tried to destroy Deep Purple's legacy, who's watched competitors undermine his career without ever responding with public attacks. Ian Gillan doesn't break silence lightly. He doesn't use his reputation as a weapon. He doesn't burn bridges or settle scores through media statements. So when Gillan releases something that begins with the words, "Roger Waters represents the moral bankruptcy of our generation," every single person in the rock industry stops what they're doing and pays attention. Because if Ian Gillan finally broke his code of silence, then Roger Waters must have crossed a line so unforgivable that even the most diplomatic man in rock music couldn't ignore it anymore. The statement Gillan released wasn't crafted by publicists or softened by management. This was raw, personal, and filled with the kind of specific details that only come from someone who's been carrying this burden for decades. Gillan wrote, "I've watched Roger Waters use his reputation as an artist of integrity to mask behavior that would shame a street corner bully. His attack on Ozzy Osbourne, while the man's family grieves, is exactly who Roger Waters has always been. Someone who finds vulnerable targets and destroys them for his own satisfaction." But Gillan didn't stop there. He made it explicitly clear that this wasn't about defending one friend or settling one score. This was about exposing a pattern that's been hidden behind Waters' carefully cultivated image as rock's moral conscience. "For 40 years I've watched Waters attack artists during their most vulnerable moments, when they're struggling with addiction, when they're facing creative crises, when their families are falling apart. That's when Roger Waters strikes, because that's when he knows his targets can't fight back effectively." That statement should terrify anyone who's ever crossed Roger Waters. Because what Gillan is saying isn't that Waters made a mistake or showed poor judgment attacking Ozzy's legacy. What Gillan is revealing is that Waters is a predator who specifically targets weakness, who waits for the perfect moment when artists are too damaged or too grieving to defend themselves, and then uses that vulnerability as an opportunity to destroy their reputations under the cover of artistic criticism. The rock community's response to Gillan's statement was immediate and intense. Within hours, musicians who have known both Gillan and Waters for decades started quietly reaching out to support Gillan's courage in finally speaking out. But what's causing the real earthquake in the industry is the realization that if Ian Gillan has been watching Waters' pattern of cruelty for 40 years, then there are decades of hidden incidents that nobody knows about yet. Here's the detail that's got everyone asking questions. Gillan specifically mentioned that his silence until now wasn't about fear or diplomacy. It was strategic. He was waiting for the moment when Waters would reveal his true character so completely, so publicly, that Gillan's own testimony would be believed rather than dismissed as professional jealousy or competitive feuding. Waters' attack on Ozzy Osbourne while his family grieves gave Gillan that moment. Because when you attack a dead man's legacy while his wife and children are still processing their loss, you're not engaging in artistic criticism. You're revealing something fundamentally broken in your character. And Gillan recognized that this was his moment to finally break decades of silence about the man Roger Waters really is. The most chilling part of Gillan's statement was the closing line. Ozzy deserved better, and so did all the other artists Roger Waters destroyed when nobody was watching. That line confirms what everyone now suspects. Waters' cruelty toward Ozzy isn't unique. It's just the first time he got caught doing it to someone whose legacy the entire world was protecting. The secret that Ian Gillan has been protecting for over 50 years finally makes sense when you understand what Roger Waters actually did to Deep Purple during their darkest moment in 1973. And this wasn't some casual business competition or artistic disagreement between rival bands. This was Roger Waters deliberately trying to destroy Deep Purple's lineup during the exact moment when Ritchie Blackmore was considering leaving the band, using insider knowledge about their internal crisis as a weapon to advance his own career. It started in the spring of 1973, when Deep Purple was privately dealing with the most serious threat to their existence since forming. Ritchie Blackmore was becoming increasingly frustrated with the band's direction. Tensions between band members were reaching a breaking point, and there were very real discussions about whether Deep Purple could survive in their current form. This was information that was supposed to stay completely private, handled internally by the band and their closest management team. But Roger Waters somehow got detailed intelligence about Deep Purple's crisis, and instead of respecting the privacy of fellow musicians going through a difficult period, Waters saw an opportunity. He approached Ritchie Blackmore directly, not as a concerned colleague offering support, but as someone ready to exploit Blackmore's vulnerability for his own benefit. Here's what Waters proposed, and this comes directly from conversations Blackmore had with Gillan years later. Waters pitched Blackmore on joining a new supergroup project that Waters was supposedly assembling, promising creative freedom and artistic respect that Blackmore wasn't getting from Deep Purple. But the timing of this offer wasn't coincidental. Waters approached Blackmore during the exact 2-week period when Blackmore was most seriously considering leaving Deep Purple, when the internal tensions were at their absolute worst. The proposal itself was designed to be maximally destructive to Deep Purple. Waters wanted Blackmore to commit to this supergroup project on a timeline that would have made it impossible for Deep Purple to fulfill their existing tour commitments. If Blackmore had accepted, it wouldn't have just meant losing their guitarist. It would have meant canceled tour, breached contracts, and potentially millions of dollars in penalties that could have bankrupted the band entirely. But here's the part that reveals Waters' true character. The supergroup project Waters was pitching didn't actually exist. When Blackmore started asking specific questions about other musicians involved, about recording schedules, about which label was backing the project, Waters' answers kept changing. Blackmore eventually realized that Waters was using a fictional opportunity to try pulling him away from Deep Purple during their most vulnerable moment. What made this betrayal especially calculated was how Waters obtained his intelligence about Deep Purple's internal crisis. Waters had befriended one of Deep Purple's sound engineers during a festival where both bands performed, and that engineer had shared confidential information about the band's tensions, thinking it was just casual conversation between music professionals. Waters took that privileged information and weaponized it, using his knowledge of exactly when Blackmore was most vulnerable to launch his recruitment attempt. Ian Gillan didn't discover what Waters had done until years later, when Blackmore finally told him the full story during a reconciliation conversation after their own relationship had been damaged by Deep Purple's lineup changes. Blackmore admitted he'd kept Waters' approach secret because he was embarrassed that he'd even considered it, and because he didn't want to create more drama during an already chaotic period for the band. When Gillan learned the truth, he was furious, not just because Waters had tried to destroy Deep Purple's lineup, but because of the calculated timing and the exploitation of insider information. Waters hadn't competed fairly or made a legitimate offer to a musician he respected. He deliberately targeted Blackmore during a moment of maximum vulnerability, using intelligence that should never have left Deep Purple's inner circle. But Gillan made a strategic decision to stay silent about Waters' betrayal. Deep Purple had survived their 1973 crisis. The band had moved forward with different lineups, and publicly accusing Roger Waters of attempting to sabotage them years after the fact would have created more damage to Deep Purple's legacy than it would have caused Waters. So Gillan buried the story, protecting Deep Purple's reputation while privately knowing exactly what kind of man Roger Waters really was. What makes this 1973 incident so relevant to Waters' attack on Ozzy Osbourne is the identical pattern. Waters targets artists during their most vulnerable moments. When they're dealing with internal crises, when they're facing personal struggles, when their families are grieving. That's when Roger Waters sees opportunity rather than tragedy. That's when he strikes, because that's when his targets are least able to defend themselves or fight back effectively. The Ritchie Blackmore incident wasn't an isolated mistake or a moment of poor judgment. It was Roger Waters operating exactly as he's operated for 50 years, finding wounded artists, exploiting their vulnerability, and justifying his cruelty as somehow serving artistic integrity or competitive necessity. And Ian Gillan has been carrying this knowledge for decades, watching Waters build a reputation as rock's moral authority while knowing the truth about how Waters actually treats fellow musicians when he thinks nobody's watching. What nobody realized until Ian Gillan's statement is that he hasn't just been silently witnessing Roger Waters' cruelty for decades. He's been documenting it, not in some obsessive vendetta or competitive jealousy, but as a moral witness who understood that someday, someone would need to stand up and prove that Waters' pattern of destroying vulnerable artists wasn't imagination or misunderstanding. It was systematic, deliberate, and completely at odds with the principled artist reputation Waters had carefully constructed. Gillan's private files reveal incidents that span 4 decades, each one following the same disturbing pattern. Waters targets artists during personal crises, uses artistic integrity as cover for personal attacks, and times his strikes for maximum damage when his victims are least able to defend themselves. And every incident Gillan documented shows Waters exploiting the exact same vulnerability: musicians who can't fight back without looking petty, defensive, or unprofessional. One of the most damaging accounts Gillan recorded involves a 1987 industry event in London, where Waters publicly humiliated a younger progressive rock artist who'd recently lost his record deal. This musician had idolized Pink Floyd, had cited Waters as a major influence, and approached Waters hoping for advice or mentorship during a devastating career setback. Instead, Waters used the encounter to lecture this artist about how his commercial failure proved he lacked genuine artistic vision, and suggested that perhaps he should consider whether he actually belonged in music at all. Gillan witnessed this entire interaction. He watched a young musician approach his hero during one of the worst moments of his career, and he watched Roger Waters destroy what little confidence that artist had left. The young musician left that event completely shattered, and according to Gillan's notes, quit music entirely within 6 months. Waters had used someone's vulnerability and admiration as an opportunity to demonstrate his own superiority and judgment. But what Gillan's documentation reveals most clearly is Waters' pattern of attacking artists specifically during personal tragedies. When musicians were dealing with addiction, when they were going through divorces, when family members were dying. That's when Waters would release statements questioning their artistic credibility or professional competence, always framed as objective criticism, but always timed to cause maximum emotional damage. Gillan recorded multiple instances where Waters criticized artists' recent work or career decisions within weeks of those artists experiencing personal catastrophes, and the criticism wasn't constructive or thoughtful. It was designed to pile additional shame and failure onto people who were already struggling to survive their circumstances. Here's what made Gillan finally break his silence. For decades, he'd maintained these private records thinking that documenting Waters' behavior was enough, that bearing witness was sufficient moral action. But when Waters attacked Ozzy Osbourne's legacy while Sharon and the Osbourne family were still grieving, while they were still processing the loss of a husband and father, Gillan realized that his silence had become complicity. Every time Gillan had stayed quiet about Waters' cruelty, he'd enabled Waters to attack another vulnerable artist. Every time Gillan had chosen to protect rock's brotherhood code by not publicly calling out Waters' behavior, he'd given Waters permission to find another wounded target. The documentation wasn't enough anymore. Silence wasn't enough anymore. Gillan's files prove what everyone in the rock industry has quietly suspected for years, but never dared to say publicly. Roger Waters doesn't practice artistic integrity. He practices calculated cruelty disguised as principled criticism. He doesn't hold other artists accountable to higher standards. He finds their weakest moments and twists the knife. The most devastating part of Gillan's documentation is how clearly it shows that Waters understands exactly what he's doing. The timing is too precise, the targeting too specific, the attacks too perfectly calibrated to cause maximum damage. This isn't someone with poor social skills or brutal honesty. This is someone who has weaponized his reputation as an artist of principle to justify behavior that would be recognized as psychological abuse in any other context. And Ian Gillan's decision to finally release this evidence means one thing. He's done protecting Roger Waters from the consequences of his own cruelty. Even if it costs Gillan friendships, business relationships, and his own reputation as rock's ultimate diplomat. Ian Gillan's decision to break 50 years of silence triggered something nobody expected. A complete realignment of how rock's old guard views accountability, legacy, and the difference between artistic integrity and human cruelty. Within hours of Gillan's statement, the whisper networks that have protected controversial figures for decades started breaking down, and legendary musicians who have spent their entire careers avoiding public controversy began quietly signaling their support for Gillan's courage. The immediate response from other classic rock figures was careful but unmistakable. Nobody wanted to pile onto Roger Waters publicly, but private messages to Gillan's team, social media likes on posts supporting his statement, and carefully worded interviews all sent the same message. The old guard knows Gillan is telling the truth, and they're done pretending that Waters' behavior is acceptable just because he's a legendary artist. What's driving this industry shift isn't just sympathy for Ozzy Osbourne's family or respect for Ian Gillan's reputation. It's the recognition that Waters crossed a line that the entire rock community considers sacred. You don't attack a dead man's legacy while his family is grieving. You don't use someone's death as an opportunity to settle scores or prove your artistic superiority. That's not criticism. That's not holding people accountable. That's cruelty masquerading as principle. The cultural moment we're witnessing is bigger than one feud between two legendary musicians. This is rock's old guard finally confronting a question they've been avoiding for decades. At what point does protecting a fellow artist's reputation become enabling their worst behavior? When does the brotherhood code that says you never publicly attack another rock legend become the same code that lets predators operate without consequences? Gillan's statement forced that question into the open, and the answer from other musicians has been surprisingly clear. Artistic genius doesn't excuse personal cruelty. Commercial success doesn't justify exploiting vulnerable people. And the fact that someone created revolutionary music 40 years ago doesn't give them permission to destroy other artists' reputations and emotional well-being for the rest of their lives. What makes this reckoning so significant is that it's coming from Gillan specifically. This isn't some controversial figure with an axe to grind or a reputation for stirring up drama. This is Ian Gillan, the man who spent 50 years being rock's diplomat, the artist who's maintained relationships across every divide in the industry, the musician who everyone respects as fundamentally decent and trustworthy. When Ian Gillan says someone's behavior has become unacceptable, people listen. The cost Gillan is paying for speaking out is real and substantial. There are business relationships that will suffer, festival bookings that might disappear, collaborative opportunities that will evaporate because he chose to break rock's code of silence about a fellow legend. Gillan knew all of this before releasing his statement, and he did it anyway because he decided that protecting Roger Waters' reputation wasn't worth the cost of enabling more victims. That decision is resonating throughout the industry because it represents a different model of what it means to be a rock legend. Not someone who uses their status to attack vulnerable people and hide behind artistic integrity, but someone who uses their status to protect those who can't protect themselves, who speaks truth even when it's costly, who understands that real integrity means accountability for how you treat other human beings. The question hanging over the industry right now is whether other artists will follow Gillan's example and come forward with their own experiences of Waters' cruelty. There are rumors of other musicians preparing their own statements, other documented incidents waiting to be revealed, other victims who have been carrying their silence for decades and finally see an opportunity to speak without being dismissed or attacked. Roger Waters built a 50-year career on the image of being rock's moral conscience, the artist who refused to compromise his principles for commercial success. Ian Gillan just proved that image was a lie, and that Waters' real legacy might be the trail of damaged artists he left behind while everyone was too intimidated or too loyal to call him out. And the rock community is finally ready to choose sides, not based on musical genius or commercial success, but based on something much simpler, how you treat people when they're vulnerable and can't fight back. This story is breaking open right now with more classic rock artists quietly supporting Gillan's courage every hour. Hit subscribe and smash that notification bell because we're tracking which other legends might finally break their silence about Waters' decades of documented cruelty. Drop a comment. Did Gillan wait too long to speak out, or was his timing perfect? The rock world is choosing sides, and this is just the beginning of the reckoning.